Hey, what's up? One of the things I'm known for within the circle of people who really care about debating and taking action for the future of veganism right now is that I have openly said in the past that veganism is not a community. And the people who take this more seriously respond to it more positively. And on the other hand, a lot of people respond to that statement in a really kind of shallow way by getting angry and complaining that I'm being negative. Now, it's not a negative statement. If you've heard what I've said in earlier videos on this, in discussing the extent to which veganism is not a community, I'm engaging the viewer in thinking about what it means to be a community. And even some very small and powerless ethnic minorities within the United States and Canada actually have composed real communities. Iranian Americans are a very small minority in the United States. Many of them arrived as refugees, not all. Some of them arrived, as really poverty-stricken refugees from Iran. But not only do they have a real community that exists and has, community centers, has places you can go, has offices and lawyers and meetings, and, they do the things the community do, they also have groups that lobby Congress and that try to influence the American government. Now, maybe the ultimate example of this historically is the Cuban exile community in the United States. Nobody could say that Cuban Americans are not a community. There are several communities, and, the different communities don't necessarily get along. There are Cubans in Miami and elsewhere, and, they have real political organizations. They have real community centers. I think they have a couple of museums, as I recall, like telling the history of their experience as Cuban Americans. And again, many of them arrived as poor refugees and exiles, and they built a real community. Now, I realize it's slightly provocative, but I'm not being negative in putting forward the idea of challenging vegans to say, well, look, do you know anywhere in the world that vegans exist as a community? And in part and parcel of that discussion, I was drawing out the contrast between the pretensions that vegans have. Pretensions aren't evil, but, we all got our pretensions, to being a community and a movement. And then looking at, well, what about veganism within Taiwan? What about veganism within India? Veganism in places where cultural history and religion actually do bring in some aspects of community. And that's very problematic and challenging for Western vegans to think about. So, look, people who took that line of thought seriously tended to respond to it positively. They understood what I had to say and said, okay, all right, now we have to think about what it means to be a community in the 21st century. But there are other people who maybe didn't listen to what I had to say all the way through, who responded very negatively, and he said, this guy is being negative. And it's worth thinking about what it means to be negative. If I was doing movie reviews, being negative means that I'm giving a movie a bad review, maybe for no good reason. I'm being negative just to get attention, just to say really outrageous things about what a terrible movie this is, without really sincerely engaging with the material. This is the sense of being negative on the internet. I really think if you watch through the videos on this channel, in many ways I'm recklessly optimistic. In many ways the message I'm sharing with you is positive. And in saying to you, for example, veganism is not a community, and there are many videos on this channel talking about it, saying, look, I would love to be part of a vegan community. I would love to feel like a member of a community. I would love it. Now, what is a community? If I die, who's going to be at my funeral? The two examples I happen to use. If you're an Iranian American who's really part of an Iranian exile community in the United States, there's probably a funeral parlor. There's a specific funeral home and graveyard associated with your community, and members of the community are going to be there. Not everybody, but especially leaders of the community. If you're a Cuban American who's really part of that expatriate exile community in Miami or somewhere else, they have their own churches, they have their own funeral parlors and so on, or they have maybe it's a Catholic church other people use, but they're especially associated with. Who's going to be at your funeral? Who's going to be at your wedding? I'm unemployed. Who's going to help me find a job? If I were really a member of the Jewish community here, I would be able to go to the rabbi and say, I'm looking for work. In Judaism, it's also a way to find a husband or wife. We go and people can openly say to their rabbi, well, I joined this temple because I was hoping to meet a young woman. My old temple I used to be a member of, there's nobody there. Birth, death, marriage, career, community is a meaningful part of all of these things. And Facebook groups where people give each other the thumbs up and the check mark is a meaningful part of none of these things. And having the money and organization to put together a legal challenge, to lobby government, to bring a court case about a particular set of apes that are the property of a particular university that are being tortured to death, what have you, having that depth and that mutual trust and cooperation, that comes out of community. And again, my message is really positive in talking about that as a goal and an aspiration worth having, worth thinking about, especially if you live somewhere where there's a significant number of vegans. But it's also really important to recognize that's not the situation we're in now. So this is not a shallow insult to people who are on vacation in Thailand, who hang out for 2 weeks with other stoned yoga bums and compare tattoos and go swimming in the River Pai, that they're not members of a community. You think that's a community? You think next week there isn't a different bunch of hippies with dreadlocks who check into that same hotel and swim in that same river? It's not a community, homeboy. It's not. Not even compared to the really low standard of, again, Cuban exiles. In my earlier video, I talked about in Toronto, the Sikh community. The Sikhs are a tiny ethnic minority in Canada, but they are really organized, and they have representation within the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and they pull weight at City Hall, and they have lawyers and so on. And again, measured as a population, measured as a percentage of the population, even in the city of Toronto, they're nobody. But they have a real community, so they're somebody, right? What about vegans? We're nobody, and we're nobody, and we're nobody, and we want to come on the internet and front like we're really somebody. Well, there's potential there. I hope to see it in the future, but... So this brings me to the subject of this video, which is that I also do not believe that veganism is a philosophy. And it's in this same positive sense that I'm stating this critique and pointing this out to you. The original definition of veganism, which was amended in its wording a little bit, but still on the British Vegan Society, in its preamble it says veganism is a philosophy that. And what follows after that statement is, a very pragmatic approach of saying people who eliminate the use of animal products and exploitation of animals to the greatest extent possible and practical. But it does begin with the statement, veganism is a philosophy of that. And a pretty unenlightened crowd of guys I was talking to last night, who were all vegan, were quite upset and offended when I made a very simple and blunt statement that no, I do not believe that veganism is a philosophy. I don't believe it exists as a philosophy today. In the future it could, things could change, things could move in that direction. And I mean, obviously their reaction to that was that they felt I was taking something away from veganism, that I was making it something smaller and weaker than it really is by saying openly, this is not a philosophy. And I'm not. I mean, we're discussing the way things are and where things are going to go from here. Now, what is a philosophy? It doesn't make veganism stronger if it's a philosophy. There are many, many philosophies in the world that exist on paper, but are hopelessly searching to have any kind of practice, any kind of effect in the real world. It's much better to be a praxis in search of a philosophy than it is to be a philosophy in search of a praxis. All right? So this is not really a bad thing for veganism. As I've said in many of my videos on politics, when you just have a practical method of social change, that's really strong, because then you can unite people who are left-wing, right-wing, centrists, people who are feminists, people who don't really care about feminism. Part of the strength of veganism is the diversity of people it can bring together. In that sense, many times, when I've talked about this with like real politicians in Canada, I've compared it to the anti-nuclear movement back in the 1980s. In the 1980s, people with really different political views and values were united briefly because they wanted to reduce nuclear arms and they were concerned about nuclear waste and related issues. Now, it didn't last. Obviously, after the Soviet Union collapsed, this alliance dissipated. But while it lasted, you had people who were interested in ecology, people who were interested in human rights, people who were communists, people who were anti-nuclear because they supported Russia. But you also had right-wing people who did not sympathize with Russia, but who thought this was an important issue they wanted to engage with. They were really worried about, the environment and the future of mankind and nuclear weapons policy and what have you. So yeah, you can have, the people think that a single issue cause People think that a praxis, that a diet, that if veganism is only a diet, that makes it weaker, that it'll reach fewer people and be smaller. And the opposite is true. If it's just a diet, everyone can get into it. If it's just a lifestyle, everyone can get into it. If it's an ethical commitment that we can talk about in isolation, then it's an ethical commitment a Christian can make, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a complete atheist, a nihilist. If it's an ethical decision we can make in any philosophy, in any philosophical framework, that's stronger than being tied to a particular philosophical framework. I'm going to bring this back to something wise my father said to me when I was a kid. I was a really small kid. And, when I was a kid, for whatever reason, people used to always have these debates. It came out of the newspapers in those days of, this is not art. Every so often, the newspapers would have a photograph of some piece of modern art that the government had paid millions of dollars for, and there would be outrage, and people would complain, this is not art. And I remember my father said to me very simply, they're having the wrong debate. The question is whether or not this is great art, whether or not this is good art. But the fact that it exists, that it's in a gallery, and people are willing to pay $1 million for it, means the other debate is over. We're not having the debate of whether or not this is art, because it's in a gallery. Some people like it. Some people are willing to pay money. Therefore, it's art. Whether or not you like it, whether or not it's great art, what its historical significance is, those things we can debate. But this is art or this is not art, that's not what we're debating anymore. Okay? So with philosophy, likewise, one of the things I have to say to you is we're past the point of debating whether or not something is a philosophy. When it's in a book and it's in a university, there are courses taught on it. It's in the Department of Philosophy. It's on that philosophy shelf. Okay? Hegel. I don't like him. I think he's a lousy author. I think it's a lousy philosophy. I think it's a bad philosophy. I think it should not be influential in the 21st century. But am I going to debate with you whether or not it is a philosophy? No. It's a real philosophy. That debate is over. Karl Marx, Marxism, it's a philosophy. I disagree with it. I've read tons of this stuff. I'm very well read in European philosophy. Lost years of my life doing that, you could say. But I've read all these guys, Marx and Hegel and what have you. But we're not debating whether or not Marxism is a philosophy. It's obvious to anyone, and the book is on the shelf. The courses are taught in the university. Okay? With veganism, this is not true. And it's not even remotely debatable or conceivable that it's true. It does not exist in this form, and it never has, which is interesting. Now, the idea of veganism has appeared in a number of different unrelated philosophies, including ancient Greek philosophies. If you look into it, the ancient Greeks had some really interesting debates about vegetarianism and killing animals. They're much more interesting than what came up under Christianity for many centuries. So yes, the idea has been debated in a philosophical context, but no, veganism is not a philosophy. And in the definition of veganism, to say veganism is a philosophy that ... is really misleading, because that suggests that veganism existed first as a philosophy, and then this just happens to be its practice. This just happens to be the way people implement that philosophy. And the opposite is true. This was a practice. This was a thing people did because they felt it was important. And various people can add on a philosophy or attach it to a philosophy afterwards. I've said before, the single biggest example of this is happening right now. When the Hindus really get a hold of veganism, it's going to blow up. Hinduism historically has not been vegan. It's been vegetarian and has regarded milking cows as okay under certain idealized conditions of the cows being treated well, blah, blah, blah. But it's very obvious that in terms of the broadest and vaguest definition, just cultural Hinduism, people who are culturally Hindu in background can obviously respond to the ethics and the message of veganism in a big way, and then it'll take off in India. So some philosophy, or maybe several competing philosophies within India, will get attached to veganism. But still, I think it's unlikely that veganism is really going to be a philosophy. And it's not a bad thing. The message I'm sharing with you now is not negative. Look, we're coming up on 15 minutes. I wanted to give a shout out to Vegan Cheetah I know most people on this channel are already aware of both channels, but in case you don't know his work, or maybe you only remember him from like more than a year ago, I'm going to give a link to his latest video below this video. He's doing real talk about issues that most people are not willing to talk about. I think it's things that a lot of people think about, but they're not comfortable really talking about. I mean, he comes on camera, like me, he has no script, he does it off the dome, and I've got to say, I think he brings a lot of thought-provoking material to the net. I've been really impressed with him, especially lately. And, the funny thing is, when I was watching this video we just put up, where he's talking about veganism and education, what he has to say about it is actually more rational than what I said about it. I talked about a similar issue several months ago. But what I had to say was actually based in emotion. It was not terribly rational. People think of my channel as ultra rational. But I was saying stuff like, look, I really feel bad for these people who are dropping out of college. I feel bad for these people who are dropping out of high school in response to this message of the veganism. And I was really talking about my feelings and that I feel bad for you. Like, I feel bad for these guys who are destroying their long-term future as part of a kind of diet fad run amok. But actually what Cheetah says here brings something pretty rational attached to the picture. So look, yeah, I've become infamous within a small circle of people for being the one guy who's willing to say, no, veganism is not a community. In this video, I'm saying to you, veganism is not a philosophy. But if you think that's a negative message, I've got to say, you're really not listening, because the reality of what I'm telling you is recklessly optimistic about the future.